The morning sun streamed through the massive windows of Atlanta International Airport, casting long shadows across the busy terminal floor. It was just another Monday morning for most travelers, but for Staff Sergeant Jonathan Pierce, this was a day he'd been looking forward to for months. After 3 grueling tours in Afghanistan, he was finally heading to Washington, D.C. to receive recognition for his service, a distinguished service medal that represented years of dedication to his country. The airport buzzed with its usual morning chaos. Business travelers rushed past with their rolling suitcases, families herded sleepy children toward their gates, and airport staff weaved through the crowds with practiced efficiency. Pierce stood up in his perfectly pressed military uniform, drawing respectful glances from passers-by. Some even smiled and nodded in appreciation, while others whispered quiet "thank you for your service" as they passed. At Gate B-23, the boarding process for Flight 2857 to Washington, D.C. was already underway. Pierce waited patiently in line, his military training evident in his straight posture and calm demeanor. In his hand, he held his first-class ticket, a rare treat he'd allowed himself for this special occasion. His mother had insisted on helping him upgrade the ticket, saying, "You deserve to travel in comfort just this once." As he made his way down the jet bridge, Pierce couldn't help but think about his family. His mother would be waiting in D.C., probably already planning to take too many pictures and tear up during the ceremony. The thought brought a small smile to his face. 3 years in combat zones had taught him to appreciate these moments even more. Stepping onto the plane, Pierce politely nodded to the flight attendants who welcomed him aboard. The first-class cabin looked exactly as he imagined: spacious leather seats, extra legroom, and the quiet atmosphere of luxury travel. He checked his boarding pass again. Seat 3A, a window seat with a perfect view of the sunrise. But as he approached his assigned seat, his steps slowed. An elderly woman in designer clothing occupied his seat, her expensive handbag placed on the empty seat beside her. She was busy tapping away on her phone, gold bracelets jingling with each movement. Pierce cleared his throat gently, not wanting to startle her. The woman glanced up briefly, then returned to her phone, acting as if he weren't there. Pierce waited a moment, then spoke in the same respectful tone he used countless times during his service. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said softly. "I believe you might be in my seat. I'm in 3A. The woman's perfectly manicured fingers paused over her phone screen. She looked up again, this time her gaze traveling slowly from his polished boots to his decorated uniform before finally meeting his eyes. Her expression shifted from mild annoyance to something else entirely, something Pierce had seen before but had hoped to never encounter again. Other passengers were starting to board now, creating a slight bottleneck in the aisle as Pierce stood waiting. A flight attendant noticed the situation and began making her way forward, her professional smile masking her concern. The morning sun continued to stream through the small airplane windows, but suddenly the warm cabin felt a bit colder. Just behind them, unknown to both Pierce and the woman, another passenger watched the scene with growing interest. This observer's presence would soon transform what could have been just another unfortunate incident into something much more significant. But for now, Pierce stood quietly, his training and dignity intact, as he waited for the woman's response. The tension in the air grew thicker as other first-class passengers settled into their seats, some pretending not to notice the situation while others watched with poorly concealed interest. The woman's next words would set in motion a chain of events that would make this flight memorable for everyone on board, though not for the reasons anyone might have expected. The woman's response came with a dismissive wave of her hand, her voice carrying clearly through the first-class cabin. "Oh, there must be some mistake," she said, her tone dripping with fake sweetness. "This is first class, dear. Your ticket must be for economy." She emphasized the word economy just enough to make her meaning crystal clear to everyone within earshot. Staff Sergeant Pierce remained calm, though his heart was beating a bit faster now. He'd faced down enemy fire in Afghanistan, but somehow this felt different. This wasn't about him anymore. It was about every service member who'd ever faced similar treatment. He reached into his uniform pocket and pulled out his boarding pass again. "No mistake, ma'am," he said quietly, holding out the ticket for her to see. "Seat 3A first class." His voice stayed steady, professional, the same voice he used to command troops in the field. A few nearby passengers had stopped pretending not to notice, their faces showing a mix of discomfort and growing anger at the woman's behavior. The woman barely glanced at the ticket before letting out a short, sharp laugh. "Well, there must be some kind of computer error," she declared loudly, as if announcing it to the entire cabin. "I'm a platinum member with this airline. I fly first class twice a month. Someone like you couldn't possibly." She left the sentence hanging, but her meaning was clear as day. A flight attendant named Emmy finally stepped forward, her name tag catching the cabin lights as she moved. "Is there a problem here?" she asked, trying to keep her voice neutral despite the tension in the air. She'd seen situations like this before, but they never got easier to handle. "Yes, there certainly is," the woman said, straightening her designer blazer. "This person claims to have my seat, but there's obviously been a mistake." She gestured toward Pierce as if he were a piece of misplaced luggage. "I demand to speak to the captain. I've been flying this airline for 20 years, and I won't stand for this kind of confusion." Pierce stayed silent, his military training kicking in. He'd learned long ago that sometimes the best response was no response at all. His fingers brushed against the metal recommendation letter in his pocket, the reason for this whole trip. He thought about his mother again, about how proud she was going to be at the ceremony. He wouldn't let this incident take away from that. Other passengers were now openly watching the scene unfold. A businessman in seat 4C had put down his newspaper, his face darkening with each of the woman's words. A young couple across the aisle whispered to each other, the wife gripping her husband's arm as if to hold him back from saying something. The woman's voice grew louder, more demanding. "Look at my ticket," she insisted, waving a boarding pass in the air. "I always sit in first class. Always. This must be some kind of diversity quota thing, giving away premium seats to—" She paused again, leaving another ugly implication hanging in the air. Emmy, the flight attendant, tried again. "Ma'am, if I could just see both boarding passes, we can sort this out quickly." She kept her voice professional, but there was a slight tremor in it, the kind that comes from holding back words you really want to say. Pierce handed over his ticket without hesitation. The woman clutched hers to her chest for a moment before reluctantly surrendering it, as if afraid the piece of paper might betray her. Emmy studied both tickets carefully, her eyes widening slightly as she noticed something. The tension in the cabin had reached a breaking point. Other flight attendants hovered nearby, unsure whether to intervene. The boarding process had completely stalled, with passengers backing up into the jet bridge. Someone in the back of the line called out, asking about the delay. And then, just as the situation seemed about to boil over, a deep voice spoke up from a few rows behind. The voice carried the kind of authority that comes from years of command, the kind that makes everyone, even entitled first-class passengers, stop and listen. What happened next would change the entire dynamic of the flight, but in that moment, Staff Sergeant Pierce just stood there, straight and proud in his uniform, showing more dignity in his silence than the woman had shown in all her angry words. 3 rows behind the unfolding scene, General James Marshall had been watching everything with growing concern. He'd almost missed this flight, arriving at the gate just as boarding began, and now he was witnessing something that made his blood boil. Through 40 years of military service, he'd fought against exactly this kind of discrimination, and here it was, playing out right in front of him. The general sat quietly in his seat, his weathered hands gripping the armrests a little tighter with each passing moment. He recognized Staff Sergeant Pierce immediately. How could he not? He personally reviewed the young man's service record just last week, adding his signature to the medal recommendation that would honor Pierce's extraordinary courage under fire. In his mind, Marshall traveled back to last month's military review board. He remembered clearly the photographs and mission reports spread across the conference table. Pierce had led a dangerous rescue mission, saving 3 wounded soldiers while under heavy enemy fire. The young sergeant had shown remarkable leadership, keeping his team focused and calm during the 7-hour ordeal. And now here he was, standing silently in the face of a different kind of battle. The general watched as Pierce maintained his composure, noting how the young sergeant's military bearing never wavered. It reminded him of his own early days in the service, back in the 1980s, when he'd faced similar situations. Things were supposed to be different now. Better. Yet here they were. A flight attendant passed by, and Marshall could hear her radio quietly crackling with concerned chatter about the situation up front. More passengers were backing up in the jet bridge now. Through the plane's windows, he could see gate agents speaking urgently into their phones. This was quickly becoming more than just a seating dispute. The woman's voice carried clearly through the cabin as she continued her tirade. "I simply cannot believe this is happening," she announced to anyone who would listen. "I spend thousands of dollars with this airline every year. I know the CEO personally." Her voice took on that particular tone of entitlement that comes from years of never being told no. Marshall noticed other passengers' reactions. A young girl, maybe 7 or 8 years old, tugged at her mother's sleeve and whispered, "Mom, why is that lady being so mean?" Her mother shushed her quietly, but the question hung in the air, its innocent clarity cutting through all the adult pretense. The general had seen enough. He thought about all the young soldiers he commanded over the years, about how many of them had faced prejudice despite wearing the uniform of their country. He thought about Pierce's service record, about the lives he'd saved, about the medal he was about to receive. He thought about his own responsibility as a senior officer to stand up for what was right. Slowly, deliberately, Marshall unbuckled his seatbelt. At 68 years old, he moved a bit slower than he used to, but his presence was no less commanding. His uniform, with its rows of ribbons and stars on the shoulder, had been pressed perfectly for today's ceremony, the same ceremony where Pierce would be honored. As he stood, several passengers noticed his movement, their eyes widening as they took in his rank insignia. A former service member seated nearby came to attention instinctively. The general straightened his jacket and took a deep breath. In combat, he'd learned that timing was everything. Now, after watching this scene unfold, he knew exactly what needed to be done. The woman was still talking, still making demands, still unaware that her behavior was about to be addressed by someone whose authority far outranked her airline status. Pierce remained at attention, his face a mask of professional calm, not yet knowing that support was literally rising up behind him. General Marshall took one step into the aisle, then another. 40 years of commanding troops had taught him exactly how to handle situations like this. He'd led men and women into battle, but sometimes the most important fights happened right here at home, in everyday places like this airplane cabin. The cabin fell eerily quiet as he moved forward. Even those passengers who didn't understand military rankings could sense that something significant was about to happen. The woman, still focused on berating the flight attendant, remained oblivious to the approaching storm. The situation in the first-class cabin had reached a boiling point. The woman's voice grew louder with each passing moment, her sense of entitlement seemingly feeding off the attention she was drawing. "This is absolutely ridiculous," she declared, her designer scarf fluttering as she gestured dramatically. "Do you have any idea how much I paid for this seat?" Emmy, the flight attendant, tried once again to explain. "Ma'am, if you'll just look at your boarding pass." But the woman cut her off with another wave of her bejeweled hand. "I don't need to look at anything," she snapped. "I've been flying first class longer than you've been alive. I know exactly where I'm supposed to sit." She turned her attention back to Staff Sergeant Pierce, who hadn't moved from his position in the aisle. "And you," she said, her voice dripping with disdain, "you really should know your place." A collective gasp went through the cabin. Several passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others began to openly glare at the woman. A businessman in the second row had already pulled out his phone and was quietly recording the incident. Pierce remained still, his face a mask of military discipline, but those who looked closely might have noticed his hands tighten slightly at his sides. He'd faced much worse in combat zones, but there was something particularly painful about facing such treatment here, at home, while wearing the uniform he'd served in with pride. "I demand to speak to the captain immediately," the woman continued, her voice rising even higher. "This is clearly some kind of mistake. Perhaps they're giving away first-class seats now as some sort of charitable program." She spat out the last words like they left a bad taste in her mouth. The growing crowd in the aisle had completely halted the boarding process. Through the windows, gate agents could be seen making urgent phone calls, likely to their supervisors. Inside the plane, the tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. A young flight attendant named Tom joined Emmy, trying to handle the situation, Ma'am, I can check your ticket again, he began, but the woman wouldn't let him finish either. Oh, so now there are two of you? She interrupted. Well, let me tell you something. I'm going to call your corporate office the moment we land. I'm friends with several board members, and they'll be very interested to hear about how I'm being treated. She turned back to Pierce, her voice taking on a patronizing tone that made several nearby passengers wince. Look, I'm sure economy class isn't that bad. That's where you usually sit, isn't it? Why don't you just go back there where you belong? The cabin grew so quiet you could hear the distant rumble of planes taking off outside. Pierce still hadn't said a word, his military training evident in his steady gaze and straight posture. But the woman seemed to take his silence as encouragement to continue. In fact, she went on, reaching into her expensive handbag, I'll even pay for your economy ticket if that's what this is about. How much is it? $100? $200? She pulled out a wallet that probably cost more than some people's monthly rent. The flight attendants exchanged helpless looks. They'd been trained to handle difficult situations, but this was quickly spiraling beyond their experience. Emmy's hand shook slightly as she reached for her radio, presumably to call for backup. A child's voice piped up from somewhere in the cabin. Mommy, why is that lady being so mean to the soldier? The innocent question seemed to hang in the air, making the woman's behavior seem even more shameful by contrast. But the woman appeared immune to shame. She was now rifling through her wallet, pulling out credit cards. Here's what we'll do, she announced, as if she were proposing a perfectly reasonable solution. I'll just buy out whatever seat they've accidentally given you. Problem solved. Everyone knows these mix-ups happen sometimes. They really should be more careful about who they let book first-class tickets. Pierce finally spoke, his voice quiet but firm. Ma'am, I earned this seat, just like I earned this uniform. It was the first time he'd spoken since showing her his ticket, and the dignity in his voice made her pause for just a moment. But that pause was brief. The woman's face flushed red with anger. How dare you speak to me that way? Do you know who I am? I could buy and sell this entire plane if I wanted to. Her voice had reached a near shriek now, echoing off the cabin walls. What she didn't notice as she continued her tirade was the tall figure in military dress now standing directly behind her, his general's stars gleaming under the cabin lights. The other passengers saw him, though, and the atmosphere in the cabin shifted dramatically. General Marshall cleared his throat, the sound cutting through the cabin like a knife. The woman, still clutching her credit cards, didn't immediately turn around, too caught up in her own tirade to notice the sudden silence that had fallen over the first-class cabin. I believe, the general's voice rumbled with 40 years of command presence, that there might be something you should know about this soldier whose seat you're occupying. His words were measured, careful, but carried an undercurrent of steel that made several passengers sit up straighter in their seats. The woman froze mid-sentence, finally registering that something had changed. She turned slowly, her expression of indignation faltering as she came face to face with the general's chest full of medals and ribbons. Her eyes traveled upward, taking in the stars on his shoulders, and the color drained from her face. I'm General James Marshall, he continued, his voice carrying clearly through the now silent cabin. And Staff Sergeant Pierce here isn't just any soldier. He's one of the finest service members I've had the honor of commanding. The general took a step forward, and the woman instinctively shrank back in her seat. 3 weeks ago, the general went on, his voice taking on a storyteller's cadence that had everyone leaning forward to listen. Sergeant Pierce led a rescue mission under heavy enemy fire. He spent 7 hours ensuring that every single one of his fellow soldiers made it home alive. 7 hours of hell, ma'am, while most of us were probably just going about our daily lives. A young boy in row 2 whispered, "Wow," before his mother gently shushed him, but the general smiled slightly at the child's reaction. "Wow is right, young man. In fact, that's why we're both on this flight. Sergeant Pierce is heading to Washington to receive a Distinguished Service Medal for his actions." The woman's expensive scarf suddenly seemed to be choking her as she tugged at it nervously. Her credit cards lay forgotten in her lap, her earlier bravado evaporating under the general's steady gaze. Now, the general continued, reaching into his uniform pocket and pulling out a folded paper, I happen to have here the official commendation letter detailing Sergeant Pierce's actions. Would you like me to read it to everyone? He began unfolding the paper with deliberate slowness. I didn't know, the woman stammered, her voice barely above a whisper now. The same voice that had been so loud and demanding moments ago had shrunk to almost nothing. No, you didn't know, the general agreed, his tone firm but not unkind. You didn't know because you didn't bother to ask. You didn't know because you chose to make assumptions based on. He paused meaningfully. Well, we all know what you based your assumptions on. A flight attendant who had been watching the scene unfold stepped forward with newfound confidence. Ma'am, I've checked your ticket again. Your assigned seat is actually 23B in economy class. I believe you walked onto the wrong section of the plane. The woman's face, which had been pale just moments before, now flushed bright red. Some passengers had pulled out their phones, though whether they were documenting the moment or sharing it with friends was unclear. The businessman who had been recording earlier had a satisfied smile on his face. I've spent my entire career, General Marshall continued, his voice taking on a softer, more reflective tone, watching brave young men and women like Sergeant Pierce put their lives on the line for our country. They defend the rights of every American, even those who treat them with disrespect. He looked directly at the woman as he said this last part. The child who had spoken earlier tugged at his mother's sleeve again. Mom, is the soldier a hero? He asked, loud enough for everyone to hear. His innocent question seemed to break the spell of tension in the cabin. Yes, buddy, he is, the general answered, smiling at the boy. Then he turned back to the woman, his expression becoming serious again. And heroes deserve to be treated with respect, wouldn't you agree, ma'am? The woman's hands trembled as she gathered her belongings, unable to meet anyone's eyes. The other passengers watched in silent judgment as she finally stood, her designer outfit and expensive jewelry suddenly seeming less impressive than the simple medals on Pierce's uniform. The aftermath of General Marshall's intervention unfolded like a carefully choreographed dance. Emmy, the flight attendant who had been dealing with the situation from the start, stepped forward with renewed confidence. Her voice was professional but firm as she addressed the woman who was now clutching her designer handbag like a shield. Ma'am, Emmy said, I'll need to escort you to your correct seat in economy class. Or if you prefer, we can help you book a different flight. She gestured towards the exit, making it clear that these were the only two options available. The woman's designer heels clicked against the floor as she stood up, her movements stiff with embarrassment. The first-class cabin, which had been filled with her loud protests just minutes before, was now silent except for the gentle hum of the air conditioning. Other passengers watched with a mix of satisfaction and second-hand embarrassment as she gathered her belongings. I think I'll just go to my proper seat, she mumbled, her earlier swagger completely deflated. As she stepped into the aisle, she had to squeeze past Staff Sergeant Pierce, who maintained his military bearing even now. The contrast between his dignified silence and her previous behavior couldn't have been more striking. A middle-aged man in a business suit spoke up from his seat. You know, my father served in Vietnam. He always said you can tell a person's true character by how they treat others. His words hung in the air, adding to the woman's obvious discomfort as she hurried past. The young boy, who had been watching everything with wide-eyed interest, waved at Pierce. Can I sit next to the soldier, Mom? He asked excitedly. His mother smiled and shook her head, but the question brought warm smiles to several faces in the cabin. As Annie began leading the woman toward economy class, another flight attendant quickly moved in to wipe down the seat and prepare it for its rightful occupant. The whole cabin seemed to release a collective breath they hadn't realized they'd been holding. Staff Sergeant General Marshall said, his voice carrying the weight of authority but also genuine respect, I believe your seat is ready. He gestured to the now vacant first-class seat with a small smile. Pierce moved forward, finally able to take his rightful place. As he settled into the comfortable leather seat, several passengers began to applaud spontaneously. The clapping spread through the cabin, causing Pierce to duck his head slightly in modest embarrassment. An elderly gentleman across the aisle leaned over. My grandson's in the army too, he said proudly. When I tell him this story, he'll be glad to know there are still people willing to stand up for what's right. He nodded respectfully toward both Pierce and the general. Back in economy class, Annie was dealing with another small situation. The passenger originally assigned to sit next to the woman had politely requested a seat change. Nobody seemed to want to sit next to her for the 3-hour flight to Washington. The woman kept her eyes fixed on her phone, pretending not to notice as people whispered and pointed. Up in first class, the regular boarding process resumed. As other passengers filed past, many of them paused to thank PS for his service or to offer a kind word. One young woman even handed him a handwritten note of support on an airsickness bag, the only paper she could find. The general had returned to his own seat, but not before exchanging contact information with PS. "You know," he said quietly, "sometimes the battles we fight at home are just as important as the ones we fight abroad." PS nodded in understanding, both men knowing that this incident would likely become a teaching moment for future generations of service members. As the final passengers boarded, the cabin crew began their usual pre-flight routine. But there was something different in the air. A sense that everyone had just witnessed something important. The woman's designer scarf was still visible from economy class, but now it seemed less like a symbol of status and more like a reminder that character, not clothing, reveals a person's true worth. The 3-hour flight to Washington, D.C. turned into something unexpected, a reminder of how a single moment can touch many lives. As the plane reached cruising altitude, the story of what had happened in first class began spreading throughout the aircraft like ripples in a pond. Staff Sergeant PS spent most of the flight in conversation with his fellow passengers, each one eager to share their own stories or express their support. The young boy who had been so impressed earlier came up from economy class with the drawing he'd made, a stick figure in uniform with the words "My Hero" written in crooked letters across the top. "My dad was in the military too," one flight attendant told PS during a quiet moment. "He faced similar things back in his day. It means a lot to see someone stand up to that kind of behavior." Her eyes were bright with emotion as she spoke, and PS thanked her with a warm smile. Meanwhile, in economy class, the woman who had caused the scene sat alone, her expensive handbag now tucked away under the seat. Several passengers had requested seat changes to avoid sitting next to her. The flight attendants maintained their professionalism, but there was a noticeable coolness in their interactions with her. Back in first class, General Marshall shared stories about his 4 decades of service, speaking about the progress he'd seen and the work still to be done. "You know," he told PS, "I've given hundreds of medals in my career, but sometimes the most important moments happen off the battlefield." As the plane began its descent into D.C., something remarkable happened. A passenger who turned out to be a reporter for a major news network asked PS if she could share his story. "People need to hear about this," she explained. "Not just about the discrimination, but about how everyone stood up against it." The flight crew had already radioed ahead about what had happened. When the plane landed, the airline's regional manager was waiting at the gate. He apologized personally to PS and announced that the woman would be banned from flying with them for 6 months. More importantly, he shared that the airline would be using this incident in their staff training programs. "Sir," the manager said, addressing both PS and the general, "would you be willing to help us create a training video about this? We want to make sure our staff knows exactly how to handle these situations in the future." Both men agreed immediately, seeing another opportunity to turn a negative experience into something positive. The story spread quickly beyond the airport. By that evening, social media was buzzing with accounts from passengers who had witnessed the incident. The airline's swift response earned praise, and discussions about respect, service, and dignity filled comment sections across the internet. A week later, at the medal ceremony, PS's mother sat in the front row, tears of pride streaming down her face. But she wasn't just crying about the medal, she was crying because of the stack of letters that had arrived at their home. People who had heard about what happened on the plane wrote to share their support and their own stories of standing up against discrimination. The incident even caught the attention of military leadership. They incorporated it into their diversity and inclusion training programs, using it as an example of how to maintain dignity and professionalism in the face of prejudice. PS was asked to speak at several military bases, sharing his experience with new recruits. The woman never publicly apologized, but something changed in her too. Months later, a flight attendant reported seeing her in economy class, quietly waiting her turn to board, treating the crew with newfound respect. Sometimes the best lessons come from our most embarrassing moments. As for the young boy who had drawn the picture, His mother wrote to PS a few months later. Her son had started telling everyone he wanted to be a soldier when he grew up, not just because they're brave, he said, but because they know how to be kind too. The story became more than just a viral moment or a teaching tool. It became a reminder that sometimes the greatest acts of courage happen in everyday moments, and that standing up for what's right might mean standing up in an airplane aisle. Most importantly, it showed that one person's dignity, multiplied by those willing to defend it, can change countless lives.